So we're here to celebrate Material Girls, and I know that you should not judge a book by its cover, but it is a great cover. I love it. And Kathleen, I'll just introduce us in case you know. Kathleen is a professor of philosophy at Sussex. She's published on a huge variety of subjects. She's got an OBE, but we won't go there. My name's Suzanne Moore. I'm a journalist, columnist. I was at The Guardian and I'm not now. I'm now at the Daily Telegraph, or you can read me on Substack. And I should do a little promo for myself at the end, maybe. I've set some weird alarm to go off, but so let's hope that doesn't happen as well. One of the first things I wanted to ask you, Kathleen, is because the book is called Material Girls, but the subtitle is Why Reality Matters for Feminism. And that's sort of quite mind-blowing to me. The idea that reality somehow doesn't matter or couldn't matter. But that just shows, I think, why the kind of conflicts that we're in around some of these debates around gender is so difficult that even to reference reality is somehow controversial. So I wanted to really ask you why you wrote the book, or why did you write this book now?
Well, I wrote the book because I thought there was an opportunity for me to intervene effectively. I know that might sound a bit cocky, but I was infuriated by the state of academic feminism, to be honest, on sex and gender specifically. Like, I think some academic feminists do some really good work, especially in the social sciences, but on sex and gender, I just thought, what on earth is going on? And there was a public consultation, so we were being invited to give our views. So you'd think that there would be a range of views given, but there wasn't. It was kind of a monoculture. And so I just couldn't stop myself from initially intervening via blogs and stuff, and then gradually being asked to do various bits and pieces for magazines, and then it being suggested to write a book. But I felt like I had the capacity to analyse some of these pseudo-intellectual arguments, frankly,
yeah,
and present them clearly for what they were. And the reference to reality is really just because academic feminism has just spiraled out into the galaxy lately, unconstrained by any empirical input. And I just think it needs to come back down to earth.
So some people will say that even to talk about some of the orthodoxies of feminism, or indeed the orthodoxies of quite a lot of mainstream discourse, i.e. trans women are women, trans men are men, and so on, is in itself transphobic. Obviously, I don't think that trying to talk about facts is transphobic, and I don't think you do. And that comes through strongly in the book, that we are dealing here with some facts. But when was it that you realized actually that you were a kind of heretic?
I realized that I was at odds with the orthodoxy, or the emerging orthodoxy, when I saw Stonewall's slogan, "Trans women are women, get over it." And I thought, hang on, that's a very aggressive and literal assertion, which I don't think is literally true. And being told to get over it suggests that we're supposed to take it as literal and not complain about it or examine it, just accept it. So I thought that was a very weird move, and it gave me discomfort. And then as I started to read stuff and watch stuff, I became aware that a very one-sided story was being put forward, and I did not agree with it. I didn't agree with it. I never did agree with it. There was no real moment where I suddenly thought, oh, I don't believe this story. I never did believe it, and I don't think a lot of people believe it either. Even people who mouth the mantras. That's part of the book, really. I think they're immersed in a fiction. which is understandable and maybe therapeutically beneficial for some people, but it's also got its costs. So I think we need to examine that.
One of the things that you do in the book that I really think is so helpful. I mean, I think this book is going to be a kind of set text, even for people who completely disagree with you, because it's sort of set out so clearly. And I actually want to sort of make you talk you through what you've written, if you like, because sometimes in the sort of generalized sort of polarized debate and everybody insulting each other on Twitter, you do kind of wake up sometimes and think, how did we get here? Like, what were the steps that led to this kind of madness, really? And I think that the way that you lay out the history is really, really important. So I'm going to, like, step by step go through that with you, if that's okay, because I think it's really, to me, it was really helpful to see it laid out that way. So I hope it's helpful to others. So you start, I guess, as everybody does, with de Beauvoir and that women are born, not made. And then you tell us that actually the distinction in the early 70s between sex and gender, this is the crucial kind of point really here, was made by Anne Oakley. Now,
well, she was one of the people that
she was one of those people
I mentioned, yeah.
So we're in the early 70s and people are making the distinction between starting to make sex and gender. That's how feminists talk about these things. But quite a lot of feminists also rejected and wanted to reject the biological determinism that came with that, didn't they?
Well, that they thought came with it, yeah. Yeah, so I think the original distinction between sex and gender, or at least there is a very coherent distinction. The word gender, as I point out, gets used in all these different contexts. It means different things. So I really try hard to distinguish those different things. But one meaning of gender is the kind of social, cultural meanings around sex.
Yeah.
And that's fine. We need a word for those things. And there are obviously very different ones from culture to culture. But more than that, it came to be thought by some people, like Butler, for instance, before she wrote Gender Trouble, that if you distinguish between sex and gender, you could somehow see off this threat of what was called biological determinism, which is the worry or the idea that women and men, presumably, but mostly focused on women, are kind of biologically programmed to be domestic and not very bright and, you know, good at homemaking and stuff like that. Now that's a view that I would dispute. I don't think it's true. But the thinking seemed to be that it would be a really clever move to define womanhood in a way that wasn't biological, and then you'd avoid this threat of biological determinism. And as I say in the book, that's a bit like trying to get out of the Earth being hit by an asteroid by redefining the Earth as something that cannot be hit by an asteroid. You know?
Yeah.
It will make absolutely no difference to the empirical facts, or whatever they are, about how our biologies interact with our psychologies. So I just think that was a daft move. It wasn't done in the name of trans inclusivity. It was done in the name of trying to combat sexism. I don't think it worked. It certainly didn't work, did it? I mean, we still had people banging on about biological determinism, undeterred by this amazing linguistic maneuver. But what it has done then is opened up this space for people to say, oh, womanhood is something social. It's not just the name, a handy concept for an adult human female, it's something else. And that's then opened up a whole new space for people to insert themselves into.
To actually get rid of the biological bit.
Say womanhood is like a social role or a set of behaviors or something, or a way of being perceived.
And then you move on, don't you, in the book, to John Money and Stoller, who are doctors, I think, talking about medical conditions and often treating people who with I guess we would now call intersex. and they were concerned, I guess they make the distinction between a gender, a private feeling of gender and a public role. And then you move on from there to Anne Fausto-Sterling, who I guess has influenced a lot of contemporary thought because she has the model of sex as a continuum.
She has lots of different models, to be honest.
I found it, okay, can you talk me through?
She does say sex is a continuum, but she also says there are more than two sexes. I can't remember now, is it 5 or 6?
Five.
Yeah.
I've got written down 5, so 5 it is.
Let's go with 5. And she also at one point says that sex is just a matter of layers or something. Yeah. But I do look at all of those different claims. I mean, yeah, so go on. I should wait for the question. What's the question?
No, so she starts talking about we can define sex as a continuum because she's starting to look at chromosomes. Is that right?
Well, she thinks that, well, she makes a big deal out of a lot of chromosomal variation and bodily variation, which there undoubtedly is. Mm-hmm. but it's one thing to note the variation, and it's another to come up with a theory that says there's 5 sexes. Mm-hmm. And what you need to do then is look and see, well, does any other theory explain this data equally well or better? And I think that's obviously true, that there's a much better theory, which is that there are 2 sexes with some variation biologically, which is what you'd expect in biology because there's mutation and genetic drift and things like that. So it's not that I disagree with her drawing attention to the sort of relatively wide variety of ways in which bodies can present in relation to chromosomes. It's just the conclusions, the high theoretical conclusions that she draws, which she now sometimes says she was only ever drawing in a tongue-in-cheek way anyway. Okay. And that's a bit annoying because they've been pushed into or used. In fact, they're used by Butler. Butler in Gender Trouble cites Fausto-Sterling as someone who shows that sex in some way is constructed.
So shall we move on to Butler?
I know you want to.
Yeah, apparently I'm ignorant about her, although I've taught her, but never mind. I've taught her theory. But so Butler is, I guess, seen as a founding, I wouldn't say mother, because mother is obviously not a word that we can use these days, the founding parent of gender as performance, and therefore a lot of queer theory. And I still think that there's sort of, I'm a bit of a pick and mix sort of girl, I think there are things you can take from Butler, and I certainly think there are things you can take from Foucault, but what Butler does is say that everything is constructed in language, and there are no prior categories except these linguistic ones, which then makes it possible to move completely away from any notion of embodied sexual identity.
I mean, I think I actually do cherry pick some bits of Butler for when I write about gender identity. I think actually some of the things she says about gender identity are sensible. But what I object to in Butler is that she has this all-encompassing metaphysical position, which is that language is really our only way of accessing what is, and there's nothing we can really think about, she would say, pre-discursively, before discourse, like before language. So everything's really radically arbitrary, really. Now, that's a familiar enough position. She didn't invent that position. There's lots and lots of philosophers that have thought some version of that. I don't think it's true, but fair enough. But then she specifically picks on sex as the one thing that she just will not have you allowed to talk about, as it were, as a real thing. Whereas, of course, if she's right, her conclusion ramifies out to everything. So why be so worried about sex? So as I say again in the book, the best, from my perspective, the most coherent social constructivists allow it that there is a sense in which these things really do exist, independently of us even. You've got to make sense of that idea. There's got to be a difference between stuff I just made up and stuff that's true. but she doesn't seem to have that kind of finesse to me. And in her later books, because I read a lot of her books, and I actually reviewed her last one for the Times Literary Supplement, she allows all sorts of things like environmental catastrophe and, you know, things that you think, well, hang on a minute, I thought this was all constructed. So why are we allowed to think about this stuff and talk about this stuff as if it really exists, but not stuff? And I don't know what the answer is there, but I don't think it makes sense.
Yeah, because I mean, I guess she comes out of that kind of post-Derrida thing. There's nothing outside the text, but even Derrida said in the end, there is a sort of real that you can interpret. I mean, it's this idea, isn't it? If we don't name a thing, it doesn't exist. I mean, but gravity presumably existed before somebody called it gravity. But what really, I guess, what really bugs me about the use of certain kind of post-structuralists, postmodernists like Butler, and I've been really into it. I was really into it, I guess, in the 90s, is the context that they're coming out of, and they're post-Marx, you know, they're reacting to a failed kind of Marxism. If we have to go anywhere, you know, let's go back to Marx, who at least understood material bodies and reproductive labor and these things that are, you know, if you like, real. And then the next bit that you talk about, who I don't know too much about, is Julia Serrano, and she moves then from completely away from biological sex, and says that it's just is it just your identification that makes you a man or a woman?
Well, I mean, I think that's a constant thing she says. I mean, she was writing in the early 2000s. So I focused on her because I think she's been quite influential, that book. So she's a trans woman. And she's a biologist. So weirdly, I think she got some kind of cachet, you know, that she knows what she's talking about. But some of the things she says, I think, don't really stack up in simple scientific terms. But she was influential because she was widely read, and she wrote this book called Whipping Girl, but also because she introduced the idea of cis, or at least she brought it into popular consciousness, I think, cisgender. And so the idea is there's two kinds of women. There's the trans woman and there's the cisgender woman. And she also argues that trans is an adjective.
Okay.
So, you know, there's Asian women, I think she says, but, you know, she goes through kinds of women, and then there's trans women. It's just another kind of woman. And so that's the shift into thinking of trans, being a transsexual woman as being a literal woman. And she also describes herself as a lesbian. Okay. So I think she's just quite, you know, quite a good example of both of those things.
But does she, or is this the point? I don't know what date we're at now, but is this the point where there's a kind of separation between gender identity and your sexual orientation?
Well, I think, yes. I mean, around that time, people started to talk about sexual identities, like I identify as gay, I identify as lesbian.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, you know, well, obviously culture moves messily, and I don't, you know, I'm not a historian. That's the other thing I do keep having to say. I'm not an historian. So I really do hope that we'll have in the coming years some much richer investigations as to how we got where we are. Yeah. Joyce's book is coming out in a few months' time. Yeah. To look at that. But so I was really just taking sort of emblematic moments, as it were. And I just think around the 2000s, we did start to see this move towards gender identity emerging, which wasn't really an important concept for early transsexuals, as far as I can see. The important thing was to be trans, meaning to have some kind of bodily modification, or at least change your dress. It wasn't about how you felt inside and whether you felt like a girl or felt like a boy.
Yeah, I think it's really like interesting, the difference between orientation and identity, because I'm so often told, and I'm sure you are too, that all of these arguments that people are having are simply reruns of arguments that have already been had. For instance, Section 28, which, you know, I was there, I'm sure you were there. that was an argument about making positive representation of gay people, to me.
Mm-hmm.
It was not an argument about gender ID.
No, it wasn't. Of course it wasn't. I don't know what the analogy is just supposed to be like right side of history.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a crude analogy that doesn't make any sense. And it becomes, I mean, I don't want to start ranting, and I've obviously had a gin now.
I do have a rant. I think we're all ready for a rant here today.
It becomes particularly offensive when you realise that along with this ideology goes the idea that trans women are lesbians. Like, say, trans women, males, attracted to females, I would call them heterosexual males, are lesbians, you know, and that's supposed to be the analogy with Section 28. I mean, it's directly against the interests of same-sex attracted people, this ideology, and it's also hurting young same-sex attracted people who are misunderstanding their own circumstances and possibly modifying their bodies in permanent ways. So it's just yet another example of the sort of gaslighting, annoying tactics of trans activists. And I always make the point that trans activists are not trans people. I do not believe trans activists are speaking for trans people as a whole. So I just want to make that clear in case anyone thinks that I'm criticising.
Oh, and I completely want to echo that. And I would say most of the kind of threats and nasty stuff I've had has never come from trans people, but these so-called allies who are often guys. I'm sorry, I just see it as an incredibly another way to be misogynistic a lot of the time. So talking of that, when does the term TERF arrive? In about 2008, I think you said, but for me it was later. I'd never heard of it. When does
well, I can't exactly remember the date that I said 2008. I really should have done this one, but it was based, my understanding.
You read your own book, Kathleen.
No, yeah. It was my understanding is that it was somebody writing their blog, and they inadvertently transgressed by advertising this Mitch Fest, which is was a festival for women in the original sense, with a strong lesbian contingent, and there'd been a lot of argy-bargy about whether Mitch Fest was trans exclusive, and this woman inadvertently advertised Mitch Fest and was called to task for it, and then put up this grovelling apology in which she coined the term TERF.
Right.
And said, I'm not a nasty TERF. And it just seems to have taken off as a kind of really handy acronym that you can combine with all sorts of insults that sound great together, like fucking TERF, or sorry mum. Anyway, I won't go on. But you know,
I'm here.
Well, I don't know if she's got back in, to be honest.
You've been locked out, don't worry about it.
But yeah, it's become a slur, I think. I mean,
definitely, yeah.
It's true that like people like me sometimes recuperate it ironically, because what else can you do when people are telling you to shut the fuck up, TERF, etc. So when
we get to, you know, coming up to now, and we've got this absolute explosion of these new gender identities. I mean, some that you name I'd never heard of, like demi fluid.
And demi-fluid.
Is that like part-time kind of? I think that could be me. The demi.
Yeah. Oh well, I think we're all demi-flux, aren't we?
Demi-flux, yeah, I like it. I think I could go with it. It's like sort of you don't commit fully, really, do you?
Well, apparently what it is so if you go to the University of Kent trans policy, which is the, you know, laying out how trans people at Kent must be addressed, it's got all this list of possible identities that are protected at Kent, and one of them is demi-flux and one of them is demi-fluid. They're both worded identically. And then it says, but do not confuse these two, because one of the identities in demi-fluid, being demi-fluid, is non-binary or something. So, you know, it becomes, as I say, once you detach these identities from sex, and binary sex even, like I completely understand what it is to identify as the opposite sex, and I understand what it is to identify as androgynous, but I have absolutely no idea what it is to identify as demiflux, or pangender, which is another one where you identify with an infinite number of genders, including some possibly that haven't been discovered yet.
And it's quite powerful, isn't it, to think it could be that, though. I can see that's quite like, you know, you must feel quite sort of...
I feel like you've got a lot inside.
Yeah. When you walk into the pub and you know that you are, you know, could be anybody. I don't know if it works like that. But more seriously, I guess a lot of people have got involved in this debate, and a lot of feminists who haven't perhaps paid that much attention to this, to all of this, and have been really absolutely sympathetic towards trans people being having a hard time. I mean, I would say that's most people I know, right? We have no desire to stop the legal protections for trans people, or for them to be discriminated against, or to suffer hate crime or violence, and that's made absolutely clear in your book. But we are very concerned, I think a lot of women are very concerned about what's happening to teenagers and children, and you know, just the stats from the GIDS Gender Identity Dysphoria Service in the last 10 years, which have just risen massively, from young women, young teenage girls, basically wanting or possibly wanting to transition, or turning up in huge distress, and it's gone up, the figure, by 5,337%. So it's turned around in the public consciousness. I would have said before now, nearly all the discussion was male to female transitioning. That's sort of, but now what we're seeing is something else, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're possibly seeing lots of different things that are all being shoved together by trans activist organisations like Stonewall and treated as if they're absolutely the same. So there's obviously a difference between a late transitioning male, you know, age 45 with a wife and kids, and a teenage girl in distress, you know, with a history of anorexia and self-harm, who hates her body and feels a strong gender dysphoria. Like, so those are different things for a start, and there's lots of other different things in there that I think we need to know more about too. So that's one of my complaints about the very simplistic, childishly simplistic way that this is presented by activists as good versus bad, and, you know, you're either with us or against us, or it's this or it's that. You know, there's lots of complexity here that we need to understand. But yeah, girls are basically, it's my understanding that, you know, teenage girls who since the rise of smartphones, their whole lives have been transformed. They are now, you know, constantly in contact with objectification by others, or self-objectification, constantly taking selfies, being judged by their peers. There's stats that show that self-harm's going up generally in that age, in teenage girls. And I would like us all as a collective society to start putting the pieces of the puzzle together, and seeing that girls will take whatever tools from the culture they are offered to express their distress. And at the moment, they're being offered this narrative that you are possibly in the wrong body. There's a predominance of same-sex attracted girls in that cohort, and there's also autistic girls and girls with histories of trauma, and we need to protect them. And I don't think we're doing that at the moment.
No, I mean, obviously there's the Kira Bell case, but there's also, I mean, I get a lot of emails from therapists and medical staff concerned about what they're being asked to do after maybe only, I mean, the shock in the Kira Bell case was that she was put on that medical pathway after 3 sessions of therapy. I mean, it's just bad therapeutic practice. This is not to do with whether people, I mean, for some people it is the right thing to transition and to go on that path, but it clearly isn't. It should not be handed out in as a kind of way of just dealing with, as you say, the deep distress. And there's no data of this kind of distress compared to the distress of people, young people who present to CAMS, Children's and Adolescent Mental Health Services. You are presented, I've done a bit of therapy training, you are presented always with people at a point of distress, and at some point, if you will ask them do you ever feel like not being here anymore? And if they say yes, which they usually do, because people have those feelings, then that's suicidal ideation. But we have no way of comparing in that age group what's going on in the gender clinics to what's just going on right across the board. I mean, I just would like a lot more money obviously poured into adolescent mental health, for full stop. That's just me going on about that.
It's very salient. That's part of the conversation. I mean, if you can't get an appointment in CAMHS for a year or more, and I don't know, I mean, I believe the waiting lists at the Gender Identity Service are also long, but I'm hearing of people, not just teenagers actually, people who have just reached the age of majority. So it's not, I mean, we're treating it as if there's this really sharp cutoff, and as soon as you're 18, you know what you're doing, but I don't think that's true.
No.
We reach 18, go and have an appointment, hormones or cross-sex hormones that week. I mean, it's very weird, and I think anomalous for talking therapy and the psychological profession generally, and the psychiatric profession, to treat a psychological state of mind so quickly with a drug, so quickly, and not just sertraline, a drug that leaves irrevocable effects on your body. So, I mean, I have high hopes that the medical profession will get their asses in gear and sort this out.
Well, it's really, really shocking, isn't it, when you read the DSM-5, the criteria which is used to diagnose gender dysphoria, which is a pathology in a way, and it's so little. I mean, it's just like a child playing with the toys of the opposite sex. I mean, it doesn't, I mean, you read that and you think there's no way that I would make that diagnosis from those few things. And it's also really kind of quite paranoid, I think, about homosexuality.
Yeah.
And that is why people like me are really kind of pissed off with the idea that any of this stuff is actually radical, because it appears, absolutely anti-homosexual, anti-left, anti-materialist, and yet we are told this is somehow a kind of progression of thinking, when it in fact is a kind of reinstatement of gender roles that we really have for a long time kind of rejected.
And it's also a very handy way of making money, because once you you diversify the number of identities there are, then you multiply your customers exponentially. So, and you can sell this. I mean, I think that I talk to people in the States, and they tell me that there are surgeons advertising mastectomies to teenagers on TikTok.
Yeah, 13-year-olds. Yeah, someone sent me something.
Yeah.
13.
You need to wake up about what's going on there.
Well, it clearly is, a big business. That's kind of interesting, I think, right now, to talk about the differences between what's happening here and in the States, because clearly, we're always told that everybody everywhere else is completely happy and down with this stuff. But clearly they're not in Scotland, they're not in Ireland. Some people in America aren't, and it's perceived as always a right-wing move. But this is in the States now. This, as you say, it's huge business, isn't it, for both the pharmaceutical companies and the surgeons who are prepared to do this stuff. And we're now seeing lots of cases of them being countersued because people are not happy afterwards. I mean, I don't want to focus, like you, I don't want to focus totally on the detransitioners, because I think it kind of can take us, away from the fact that, yes, it might be, oh shit, sorry, might be right for some people. But that was when that alarm was meant to go off when we started the right time, but we didn't.
Well, can I just say, I mean, I do want to just draw attention to the fact that so much of the toxicity of this conversation comes from people in America not understanding what's going on in the UK. I mean, we have gender reassignment protected in law, which I've never said anything negative about. I think
nor have I.
should be. and there's absolutely no way that trans people should ever be discriminated against in employment or in healthcare, or face violence or harassment. None of that is acceptable. So the argument is about changing the law. Americans just don't seem to be able to get this, but it's about changing the law to protect an inner feeling instead of a behavioural process, or at least some kind of process that you can observe. And I just think we also have the NHS, so that makes a difference to the context. And again, I love the NHS. So all of that, those cross purposes just mean people are getting a bizarrely distorted idea of what it is that the argument is about. And even to the point where I'm now seeing British trans activists just sort of rehearsing American talking points as if they apply to our situation, which they clearly don't. So I saw this woman on YouTube the other day saying that she had no healthcare rights, in Britain. I mean, that's just bollocks. She does. So it just doesn't help people conflating these two situations, which are obviously very different.
Well, I think that really came out with the Trans Remembrance Day, because while that's a really important thing to think about the people who were murdered, and particularly in Brazil, because there's a lot of trans people doing sex work to pay for their own transitioning, and the States, in the last couple of years, no trans people have been murdered here. I'm not, like, we don't like murder. Let's make that clear. We don't like murder, but it was a sort of borrowing from another culture. And we had Dawn Butler standing up and saying there's no such thing as sex, and sex is assigned at birth. I don't know how anyone who's ever had a child thinks it operates, but I just imagine like these midwives dancing around a room and kind of drawing straws. It kind of isn't like that. And it kind of also, sex is, if you like, identified in a fetus at 12 weeks. And I know that because I have gone to countries where the girl child is aborted. I've done stories on sex selection. So the idea that it's assigned at birth, these, there is a generation of girls who never get born, So I think people should actually be really geographically specific when they're talking. And I think as a feminist as well, I mean, and you kind of say it towards the end of the book, if we have a politics at all, I mean, we are concerned about FGM, we are concerned about menstrual hearts, we are concerned about the so-called honor killings. We hate that word honor. And how do we tackle that with this, when this discourse predominates?
Well, that's the thing that, many things get me going about this, but one of them is the pretense of, largely middle-class academic feminists in universities or in the third sector, all graduates, the pretense that they're somehow going to be able to square that circle, still be able to do all the things feminism was supposed to do, but also have changed the subject completely onto a different group of people, because now they no longer include trans men as women, and they include trans women as women. And that's basically shifted the category, because we're no longer talking about sex or the social impacts of sex. Even we're talking about some supposed feeling, which in fact half the women don't have anyway, because they don't have a gender identity, so they don't know what that means. And so they've really just, in this completely decadent way, changed the subject of feminism and hoped that it would all be all right. And when it wasn't all right, they've told us all off and told us we've got it wrong. And if we could just give up our minds and outsource our consciences and brains to them, they would, the Fawcett Society would sort it all out, whatever. It's absolutely nonsense. And I'm so glad that the grassroots are not having any of it.
No, they're not, because, I mean, when I talk to some people, I think they talk about feminism as though it was a sort of charity and you should just be nice to everybody. Whereas my understanding of feminism is pretty blood and guts and power based. I mean, I want women to have more power. I don't want to just be, go around being kind to sort of anybody who thinks I should be kind to them. you know, I do actually try to be always, you know, kind to individual people. I do respect, I will use people's pronouns, for instance. That doesn't, you know, all of that. I think you're much the same, Kathleen. But I wanted to ask you, really, if you might not want to talk about it, but like how it's kind of affected you personally in your day-to-day work.
Well, lockdown's been good.
Okay, that says something, I think.
I mean, look, my relationships with my students are good. On the whole, I mean, I know that's hostage to fortune. There'll be some disgruntled person popping up anytime now. But, you know, on average, I think I have a reasonable professional relationships with students, and I really enjoy teaching. What I have not enjoyed is colleagues, either at my institution or in my subject area, which is philosophy, and we all know each other, or, you know, there's conferences we're all supposed to go to. I have not enjoyed them lying about me, telling the world that I'm a danger to my students, that I want them to not exist, you know, giving these absolutely horrific, uncharitable interpretations of things I've said. That has absolutely, you know, affected my working life, because I'm trying to get on with students, and, you know, I teach trans students, you know, and have normal professional relationships with them. So it's been horrible, and I'm not alone in that. I mean, anyone knows, I'm sure you do too, like what it's like to be at a toxic workplace where there's a significant number of people who really despise you, and not only despise you, but really are going to go out of their way to whip up a feeling of animosity towards you. And it's just, it's terrible. I mean, so it's personally terrible, but it's also obviously terrible for knowledge production, because I'm at university, so I'm supposed to be talking about this stuff, and my other people watch what's said about me in department meetings or online, and it puts them off getting involved, or even for sticking up for me. They just don't want to do it, because then the sort of, you know, the machine gun will come around and it will be focused at them. So it chills everybody else, it ostracizes me. And this, I'm just, you know, I'm relating this as an instructive example because it's going on in campuses all over UK, and in, you know, progressive workplaces and third sector organizations. The tactics of the opposition are just mean-spirited, uncharitable, and toxic.
Yeah, because I find that I get a lot of, you know, obviously when I wrote and said the things I did, I was able still to carry on working and get another job, but that's because I have something of a name. But every day I get emails from people, nearly always in the public sector, teachers, social workers, doctors, who feel that they cannot, it's not they even want to challenge this ideology, they feel they cannot even ask a question in a meeting, or they will be reported, or they will not be promoted. Or so, I mean, in a way, I mean, these tactics work, because it's, I mean, if I could wake up tomorrow and never have to deal with this shit again.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, you know what I mean? You're like, you
can't, because, and that's the problem. I mean, it's turned a generation of people of a certain disposition into basically like the Roald Dahl villain in a children's story, or the class. I don't know. Yes, it works, but how would you live with yourself after knowing that you've just, you know, basically become this caricature of a children's book villain? That's the way I see it. I mean, when people are like, you know, reporting me to my employer, you know, you would have been really good in the Stasi.
Yeah, but I guess, you know, you've got this compulsion to, as a philosopher, and I don't really know you, but I imagine as a person, to some sort of truth. I think that's I think that's your problem, really. It's caused you a lot of problems. I think I've got it a bit, but because you know, you keep on asking in the book these really very simple but also very complicated questions, like what is a woman, and what do concepts do, and why do we have the concept of a woman, and how do we, is that a useful tool, and what do concepts do? Because that's your discipline. Could you talk about that for a bit? Because I think it's really interesting to me the way you do.
Well, I mean, that's partly the method of analytic philosophy, which is to, really, there's no question methodologically you can't ask. And you should be able to justify your method. Now, I think what is actually really interesting about this whole area, and sort of the challenge posed to us by trans activists who are saying, trans women are women, there's no such thing as sex, we don't need to talk about sex, we can just, vacate our language from sex, from any term associated with sex. That forces me to go back and say, well, hang on a minute, why do we need, what is sex? Why do we need to talk about sex? Why does it matter? What are concepts anyway? Go right back.
Yeah.
Because some of the arguments are like metaphysical and about philosophy of language. And actually it's really hard to do, because you take these concepts for granted, obviously, absolutely for granted, and you're not often challenged that at that basic a level in philosophy. It's normally understood like there's this common ground we share, and then we can tinker around the edges, argue about those, but it's very rare that you get somebody to say, no, hang on a minute, we're going to go right into the center of the web of meaning and go, why have we got that bit? So it was actually hard to do, in a sense. It involved a lot of sort of thinking it through for myself, but that's good, because now I know.
So you, in the end, come back to this idea, I guess, that because you work out the differences between sex and gender, that the actual, when it comes to legal practice, the idea that you can change sex is a fiction.
Yeah, it's a fiction. And I think that fits with, when you look at what sex is, it's not the sort of thing you can change through drugs or surgery, or and I also think when you actually look at Hansard, as I do, you can see in the discussion that they're quite a lot of the people talking about it are quite unclear. So this is the original discussion of the Gender Recognition Act. They were quite unclear what they're talking about. Like, there's just a lot of confusion about acquired gender and how that relates to sex. But I think the best way of understanding the Gender Recognition Act is that it puts in place a legal fiction that people can change sex, so they should be treated as if they are of the opposite sex. But it's as if, not, they are. It's not saying they are. And that's obvious, because in the wording of the Gender Recognition Act, although it says something like, once you've got a legally acquired gender, you should be treated for all purposes as if you were the opposite sex, it immediately specifies there's about 5 contexts where that doesn't work. So already got various exemptions built into it. So I just think it makes most sense. I mean, my original field in philosophy is fiction, and I have always thought that this is a therapeutically useful fiction that we are being asked to get immersed in, but it's not fact. That's to me, that makes the best sense of it. And it also really makes sense of the way that the toxicity has gone around this, because effectively, when you're immersed in a fiction, what you really don't want someone to do is point out reality, because it basically removes the immersion. It's a bit like an actor on stage saying, I'm an actor. You can't engage anymore. So there's a real attempt to suppress any acknowledgement of the fact that this is a fiction by any means necessary, and that seems to be what's happening.
And I think we've been talking for about 40 minutes, but I think I'll ask you a couple more questions. And I think if people are happy with that, and then we can have another drink. So if it's, so by you saying it's a fiction, are you denying, you will be accused of denying, oh, shut up. Sorry, everybody. Are you denying, I mean, even us having this discussion it will be said we have denied the existence of trans people or caused sort of literal violence. But what I really wanted, I guess what I'm kind of want to talk about is the Stonewall and Mermaids tactics of how we got to that, because I can see the new Stonewall tactics are now completely focused on children.
Sport to some extent as well, yeah. I mean, so first of all, I'm just to be clear, I'm not denying that trans people exist, because what I am doing is arguing with a philosophical theory about identity and its significations. But I'm not saying they're not trans. I'm not saying trans people should be protected in law. I'm certainly not saying you shouldn't be able to be trans. I think you should. And if someone tried to stop that, I would argue against it.
Yeah, me too.
I'm just arguing about whether it's inner feelings that should be protected in law or something else. And I'm arguing about what it means to say, I am a woman when you're male, or I'm a man when you're female. And I realise it is distressing probably for some people to hear that I think it's a fiction, because perhaps they believe it themselves, or they just don't want to be reminded of that. And I'm sorry about that. And I'm certainly not going to go up to an individual trans person and say this. What we've lost as a society through the past, the emotional manipulation of Stonewall and Mermaids mainly, is the ability to make the general statement. Every time I say something like, I'm afraid I don't think that trans women are literally women, that's equated with, going up to a trans woman and screaming in their face, you're a man. That's not what I'm doing. I'm making a general statement, which I think is true, but I would obviously modulate for context and observe the normal politeness norms. So
how does this impact on women, on
we've lost the capacity to talk about sex freely. So you've just got to cross your fingers and hope now when you're talking about sex in an academic context. For instance, if you're talking about women, research project on women, or you're doing data collection on women, and then you've just really got to cross your fingers that someone doesn't say, sorry, are you trans inclusive? Do you mean, are you a TERF, or do you mean trans women as well? And then you've got to change the whole direction of research, or have an argument and possibly be exposed to lots of criticism. So it's really muting women and men's capacity to talk about things that matter, and sex does matter in sport, in medicine, in sexual assault statistics, in how we arrange society to protect women from violence and so on. So it's having a terrible effect on free speech. I think it's having a terrible effect on public understanding, because some people are just hearing the fiction and thinking it's literally true, and then children are hearing that and constructing their own interpretations of themselves accordingly. Yeah, it's disaster. It's absolute disaster.
What strikes me about some of this stuff is it's the kind of opposite of what it claims to be, because the notion of intersectionality gets completely lost in this and I do wonder sometimes if, I mean, like I am, it's just speculation, and it is the election, there are the elections today, but that this kind of declaration, trans rights, that's where I'm going to put my energy, and obviously on social media, and that's where everybody is, and yet there are no class politics. There is nothing about class in this at all.
And yet class is so obviously relevant, isn't it? I mean, like I say,
yeah, I think so.
This is graduates, and like you say, allies. Most trans activists I know are not trans, so it's coming out of university educated middle class people, of which I am obviously one, but I can still recognize it when I see it, confecting outrage and confecting a narrative which makes them look very virtuous on behalf of a sort of idealized, projected other, and it's very neat, isn't it? It's very, I don't know why, but it seems to be so much easier to talk about trans rights than to talk about systematic racism or the plight of the working class. There's the county police station near where I live, and they had a trans flag up. I think it was for Trans Day of Remembrance recently. But I haven't seen a BLM BLM flag up at the front of the police station. It's sort of very an easy win, I think, for politicians. I saw the Royal Navy today have got a new, I think it's the Royal Navy, got a new protocol for pronouns. You know, you can request to have your pronouns as zia or him, or whatever, something made up, per, z, zim, or something. Anyway, it's just decadent and banal, isn't it? It's just frivolous.
Okay, so I think this is going to be the last question, because people have been here so long waiting for us before we start speaking. But
they're probably all hammered.
How do we build bridges here? Because actually I think you do start to do that, and I want to do that. I mean, for all that what I'm known for and what you're known for, I mean, I don't think this is an irresolvable conflict. I think we can move forward if you know, that's my hope, right?
I hope so. I mean, I think it will require changing the terms. You know, gender identity as the priority is just not going to work. An inner feeling that is undetectable to the, you know, under any circumstances is not going to work. So my cat's now just come in.
Oh yeah, I've shut mine out. Yeah, go.
But I do think that clearly a lot of the young people who are non-binary or who are expressing, who have gender identity issues, have a lot in common with all of us, because we've all been there, and particularly women, particularly same-sex attracted women or gender non-conforming women. So I would like to see dialogue between those two groups in particular, because I think we got shared experiences. And in a way, what we're doing is that, you know, they're saying they're non-binary. On our side, we're saying that gender can be oppressive, but it's really, in some sense, the same impulse, just expressed differently. So I think there's a lot of work to do there. Yeah, I mean, that's...
So yeah. You're really, I mean, you're kind of asking for a much more non-binary view of gender.
Yeah, I am. And the same with the discussion about spaces. It's really, if only Stonewall had put its firepower behind saying there should be third spaces, all kinds of space, different kinds of sports team, you know, instead of just saying, no, trans women must go in the women's and women must accommodate them. That's a very binary kind of setup. We need to be more flexible, more imaginative,
more fluid.
Demi-flux. We need to be demi-flux.
I think that actually is, you know, that's the issue, isn't it? It's that this binary has just been replaced with this other incredibly black and white understanding, and all of us who, also, I mean, I can't think of another sort of struggle, whether I think about civil rights or the struggle for gay rights, where one group of people asked another lot of people to give up certain rights. I mean, it was, and that's what's causing the conflict that cannot be named. Still, you know, that's still difficult to talk about. So I really appreciate this book, Kathleen, and I'm really glad you wrote it. And I think that this is time now that we should go off and have a drink, and I hope everybody's enjoyed it. And both me and Kathleen are happy to come and discuss properly and answer questions in real life in the next, whenever we can do that, but we can't do it now because there's just too many people here. So please buy the book and subscribe to my Substack, suzannemoore.substack.com, for more of this sort of thing and other stuff.
I'm subscribed to Suzanne's Substack.
And really thank you everybody for being here. And